Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Pull up something comfortable. Maybe a blanket, maybe a pillow, maybe the one chair in the room that somehow feels better than all the others even though no one can explain why. Because tonight we're going into a part of military history that is not usually placed at the centre of the story. Not a famous battle, not a general standing over a map, not the frozen hills around the Chosin Reservoir, not the desperate defence of the Pusan perimeter, not the long lines of men moving through mud, snow and smoke. We are going to talk about what happened to some soldiers after the fighting stopped for the day, after the orders were given, after the rifles were stacked nearby, after the body had been pushed farther than it wanted to go, and the mind was still searching for a way to come down. We are talking about addiction during the Korean War, and more specifically, why so many American soldiers found themselves pulled toward narcotics, alcohol and heroin in a conflict that has too often been remembered only through battlefield maps and casualty numbers. And before we move any further, let me ask you something simple. What time is it where you are right now? Are you listening late at night, with the room quiet around you? Are you on a couch, already half settled in? Are you somewhere far from Korea, far from 1950? Far from the kind of cold that makes a man feel as though the wind has found the inside of his bones? Wherever you are, I hope this story gives you something more than facts. I hope it gives you a clearer sense of how people end up doing things they never imagined they would do, especially when they are young, far from home, exhausted, frightened, and living in a world where the next week cannot be counted on with confidence. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you like history that slows down long enough to notice the people inside it, it would mean a great deal if you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. You do not have to do it right this second. Do it when the story settles in. And if you feel like sharing where you're listening from tonight, leave it in the comments. I genuinely enjoy seeing how far these late night journeys travel. Now, let's go back to the summer of 1950. The Korean War began on June 25th, when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and drove south with speed that stunned American officials and overwhelmed South Korean defences. Within days, Seoul had fallen. By early July, American troops were being rushed from Japan into Korea, some of them underprepared, some of them still trying to understand how quickly a tense political situation had become a shooting war. Those first months were chaotic, costly and punishing. Units fell back toward the southeast corner of the peninsula. Men fought delaying actions, lost friends in places they had never heard of before, and began to learn that this war would not behave like a brief emergency. It would grind on. When most of us picture those soldiers, we picture them in combat. That makes sense. War presents itself through action, through movement, through the places where men advance or retreat, through the hours when every sound seems louder than it should. But a soldier's life in wartime is not made only of combat. It is also made of waiting, transfer points, transport ships, rear area camps, leave towns, barracks, bars, boredom, loneliness, and the strange emptiness that can follow fear. A man might spend days under shell fire and then find himself suddenly in a port district surrounded by neon signs, cheap liquor, strangers, and the uneasy freedom of having nothing required of him for a few hours except staying out of trouble. History tends to summarize military life in operations and campaigns. The human body remembers it differently. That difference matters because the narcotics problem associated with the Korean War did not simply begin in a trench during a moment of panic. It did not appear out of nowhere because men saw terrible things and then immediately reached for heroin. The truth was more complicated, and in many ways more unsettling. Before the Korean War even began, American occupation troops stationed in the Far East already lived in an environment where alcohol and narcotic drugs were unusually easy to obtain. Army medical observers later wrote that liquor was cheap and common among officers and enlisted men in the occupation zone, and that heroin addiction had already been noted among soldiers stationed near major Japanese ports such as Yokohama and Kobe. The war did not create that environment from nothing. It intensified it. It placed more young men inside it. It moved troops through it. It linked the stress of battle with a ready-made market of temporary relief. That is one of the most important things to understand from the very beginning. Addiction during the Korean War was not just a story about individual weakness, and it was not just a story about battlefield trauma, although trauma mattered. It was also a story about geography, about ports, about military logistics, about occupied Japan serving as a staging ground for war in Korea, about soldiers passing through places where drugs were cheaper than they were back home, and where the normal structures of family, church, neighbourhood, and civilian reputation had been stripped away. A 19-year-old far from home is not the same person he is under his mother's roof, or under the eye of people who have known him since childhood. War changes the setting first. The setting changes behaviour after that. The army psychiatrist, whose observations were later preserved in the official medical history of the Korean conflict, was careful about his wording. He did not say narcotics were the central crisis of the war. He said alcohol and narcotic offenders were a relatively minor problem, compared with the larger logistical strain of the campaign, but still a constant and ominous concern to commanders, especially among troops stationed in Japan and in rear areas of Korea. That distinction matters. We're not talking about every soldier, or even most soldiers. We're talking about a problem serious enough that doctors, commanders, and military police could no longer treat it as a handful of isolated incidents. After the war began, arrests of GI narcotic users and possessors in the Far East Command rose sharply. A Defense Department figure cited in 1953 reported that such arrests had more than tripled from 1949 levels by 1951, and this is where the story becomes harder to dismiss. Because the Korean War was not a neat war fought by calm, fully prepared men under predictable conditions. It opened with confusion. American units went into combat fast. They suffered setbacks. They watched the front line collapse and reform. They learned that 1 week's movement north could become the next week's desperate withdrawal south. The war would eventually settle into a more static struggle along fortified hills and ridges, but before that came a period of jolting reversals that left soldiers with very little sense of control. Control is important. People underestimate how much the mind depends on it. When control vanishes, some people search for routines. Some cling to superstition. Some grow numb. Some drink. Some look for something stronger. Military doctors during and after the Korean War paid close attention to psychiatric casualties, anxiety, depression, and combat stress. Later scholarship has emphasised that the war produced serious psychological injury among soldiers, even though the language of the time was different from what we use now. Men who felt overwhelmed were not walking around saying they had post-traumatic stress disorder. That term did not exist in the way we understand it today. They might be described as exhausted, nervous, unable to sleep, unable to return to the line, or simply not themselves. Some recovered quickly, some did not. Some found other ways to dull what they were carrying. The fact that a man drank heavily or experimented with narcotics did not always mean he had a fully formed addiction in the clinical sense. But it did mean that he had discovered a method of shutting the world off for a while, and for some men that became difficult to abandon. It is worth pausing here because we often prefer our war stories to be morally tidy. Courage here, cowardice there, discipline on one side, failure on the other. Addiction does not fit neatly into that arrangement. It is messy. It asks us to notice the frightened man, and the reckless man may sometimes be the same man. It asks us to understand that the soldier who stood his ground under fire may later make a disastrous decision in a port city, because he is tired of being alert, tired of remembering, tired of carrying himself like a weapon that can never be put down. None of that excuses harm. It simply makes the history more accurate. There was also a practical side to the problem that commanders struggled to handle. Narcotics were not always visible. A drunken soldier could announce himself loudly. A soldier using heroin or other opiates might not. The official medical account noted that physical inspections and undercover efforts often produce limited results. Needle marks might be hidden in places an ordinary inspection would miss. Some suspected users showed little or no obvious withdrawal when confined, which created uncertainty about the severity of dependence in many cases. The same accounts suggested that some soldiers may have been in early stages of use, taking relatively small doses or indulging intermittently during weekends and parties, rather than living in constant visible collapse. That made the problem harder to define and harder to confront. The army was trying to identify an enemy that did not always look like one, and if you are listening closely, you can probably hear the deeper question forming underneath all of this. Why would a young soldier take that first step at all? Why risk punishment, shame, sickness, or worse? The answers were not identical for everyone. For some, it was curiosity. For others, peer influence. For others, the appeal of something available, cheap, and presented as a temporary escape. For a few, it may have begun with a desire to sleep. For others, with a desire not to think. In a military world where alcohol use was already common, and where rear areas created stretches of idle time alongside sudden violence, narcotics could enter not as a dramatic plunge into ruin, but as a small experiment made on a bad night. Many destructive habits begin that way, quietly, without ceremony, without the person involved realizing that a temporary answer may decide to remain. The setting in Japan matters again here. American forces had been stationed there since the end of the Second World War, and by 1950 those occupation zones contained a nightlife economy built partly around servicemen with pay in their pockets and limited supervision once off duty. The official army source emphasized that drugs were readily obtainable in Japan before the Korean War, especially around Yokohama and Kobe. That meant some soldiers entered the war already aware of what could be found and where. Others learned quickly through rumour and barracks talk. Once troops moved in large numbers between Japan and Korea, that knowledge moved with them. The war did not need to invent a narcotics culture. It only had to keep bringing vulnerable men near one. Korea added its own pressure. By the time units were operating through Busan and other rear areas, commanders were facing the combined problem of troops under strain and illicit drugs circulating near important military transit points. The Army medical history specifically noted that, in addition to Yokohama and Kobe, Busan became a major locus of concern during the conflict. Officers sometimes made dramatic claims about widespread use within particular units, though the official account warned that such estimates were likely exaggerated when compared with actual apprehensions. That caution is important. Wartime rumour can swell fast, especially when commanders feel control slipping. But even with exaggeration stripped away, the concern remained real enough to attract sustained attention. So when we ask why so many soldiers became addicted during the Korean War, the first answer is not a single answer at all. It is a convergence, a brutal war that produced fear, fatigue, and psychological strain. A military system that routed men through Japan, where narcotics had already become available to occupation troops. Port cities and rear areas where supervision loosened. A culture in which heavy drinking was common enough to seem ordinary. Young men, many barely out of adolescence, carrying cash, boredom, confusion, and sometimes pain they had no language for. And all around them, people ready to sell relief by the dose. There is another reason this story deserves attention tonight. The Korean War sits in an uncomfortable place in American memory. It was not celebrated like victory in 1945, and it was not argued over in the same public way as Vietnam. It became easier, over time, to reduce it to a phrase, the forgotten war. But the men who fought it did not forget it. Their bodies did not forget the cold. Their nervous systems did not forget the shelling. Their families did not forget the person who came home changed, and some of those changes took forms that were easier to condemn than to understand. Addiction was one of them. The soldier who returned with a wound earned sympathy. The soldier who returned with a drug habit often faced suspicion, judgment, or silence. History has a habit of preserving what nations feel proud of and misplacing what makes them uncomfortable. That is why this story needs to be told carefully. Not sensationally, not as a scandal parade, not with the cheap thrill of saying soldiers were secretly addicts while the war raged on. That would be inaccurate and unfair. We need to tell it as a human story inside a military system, because that is what it was. We need to ask what happens when large numbers of young men are moved into a region already marked by illicit drug traffic, exposed to repeated stress, given only limited emotional language for what they are experiencing, and then expected to behave as though endurance alone will carry them through. Some endured, some broke openly, some kept functioning while quietly falling into habits that would follow them long after the uniform came off. And we should be clear from the beginning that this was not only about heroin. Alcohol was part of the landscape from the start. Official army observers described drinking as widespread among officers and enlisted men in the occupation environment before the war. Cheap liquor did not automatically produce addiction, but it normalized chemical relief. It made the idea of taking the edge off feel familiar. In that sense, narcotics did not arrive in a completely sober world. They entered a social environment where intoxication already had a place. That matters because addiction often grows most easily where the broader culture has already agreed that altered states are a routine answer to strain, loneliness, celebration, or boredom. If you have ever been exhausted enough that you wanted only one thing, just one thing, to make your body and thoughts loosen for a while, then you already understand the first inch of this road. Not the whole road, not the ruin that can lie farther down it, but the first inch. The Korean War placed some soldiers in situations where that inch appeared close at hand and came cheaply. That does not mean every man took it. It does mean that those who did were responding to more than simple recklessness. They were responding to conditions. History becomes more useful when we stop pretending conditions do not matter. Tonight, we are beginning with the broad view because we need to see the whole landscape before walking through it. We need to understand why the addiction problem was already waiting in the Far East when the war began. We need to move through occupied Japan, through the port districts, through the supply lines, through the barracks talk, through the cramped medical wards where officers tried to decide whether a young man was truly dependent or simply experimenting. We need to look at the war not only where the bullets flew, but also where men wandered after dark, where money changed hands quickly, where shame and relief sometimes sat at the same table. The story begins then, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a war widening around men who were not prepared for every kind of danger it carried. Some dangers came from artillery, some from frostbite, some from orders that arrived too late. Some came wrapped in paper, dissolved in liquid, hidden in a pocket, offered casually by someone who claimed it would help. The Korean War did not invent soldier addiction, and it would not be the last conflict to expose it. But in Korea, the pattern became clear enough that commanders could see it, doctors could record it, and historians would later recognize that this was a warning flare from a military world struggling to understand what war was doing to the people asked to fight it. Before an American infantryman crossed into Korea, before a frozen rifle trench, before a wounded soldier was carried down a muddy road toward a field hospital, the drug world that would later trouble the Far East Command was already there. It had its own history, its own roots, its own habits, and its own places of exchange. This is important because addiction during the Korean War did not emerge in a sealed military laboratory. It grew inside a region that had already spent decades living with opium cultivation, narcotics production, colonial monopolies, wartime medicine, black markets, and the disorder that followed Japan's defeat. By the time young American servicemen began moving through Japan and Korea in greater numbers, they were entering a landscape where intoxicants were not rare discoveries. They were already part of the environment, sometimes openly discussed, sometimes hidden in storefronts and alleys, sometimes passed from one hand to another in the ordinary rhythm of a port city after dark. To understand that landscape, we have to go farther back than 1950. Korea under Japanese colonial rule was not merely a place where drugs passed through on the way elsewhere. It became a significant site of production. Historian John M. Jennings has shown that Korea emerged as a major producer of opium and narcotics in the 1920s. and by the 1930s became an important supplier to the opium monopoly associated with Japanese-sponsored Manchukuo. That point changes the whole frame. When people hear about drugs in East Asia during the early 20th century, they often imagine China alone, or older memories of the 19th century opium wars. But the Korean peninsula had been drawn deeply into this economy as well, not by accident, and not only at the margins. It formed part of a wider imperial system in which medical, commercial, and illicit interests overlapped in ways that would matter long after the formal empire collapsed. The word monopoly can sound bureaucratic, almost harmless, as if we are talking about paperwork and licensing offices rather than addiction and profit. But in Manchukuo, the opium monopoly was tied to a larger imperial project. Recent scholarship on the Japanese Empire has emphasized that Japanese and Korean subjects participated in the production and circulation of opium in Manchukuo, and that state authorities drew significant revenue from the trade even as illegal cultivation and selling spread beyond official control. That combination is worth lingering on. Once a government builds institutions around a lucrative narcotics economy, the habits of production do not vanish simply because the political structure that managed them later weakens or falls. Farmers know what grows. Middlemen know whom to contact. Smugglers know routes. Officials know how to look away. The war in Korea would arrive in a region where such knowledge had already been accumulated for years. There is a tendency to imagine that 1945 marked a clean break in Asia. Japan surrendered. The empire ended. Occupation began. New laws arrived. The old systems were swept away. That is how timelines look in textbooks, but societies do not reset that neatly. In October 1945, only weeks after Japan's surrender, the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers issued SCA-PIN 130, a directive that prohibited the planting and cultivation of narcotic plants, blocked unauthorized importation, banned exportation and manufacture, and froze existing stocks of opium, cocaine, heroin, and related substances. A directive like that does not appear out of nowhere. It tells us that occupation authorities were immediately concerned not only with rebuilding a defeated country, but also with controlling drug inventories and drug pathways that already existed. The war had ended, but the chemical residue of wartime Asia had not. Post-war Japan then entered a period of immense strain. Cities were damaged, food was scarce, millions of soldiers and civilians were demobilized or repatriated. Official systems were overwhelmed, and unofficial systems rushed in to fill the gaps. A 1968 review published by the United Nations described how, in the confusion after the Second World War, considerable quantities of amphetamines and narcotics reached the market through ex-army personnel. The same review noted that drug offences concentrated in busy urban streets and around military bases, exactly the kinds of places where defeated civilians, displaced populations, and foreign servicemen would encounter one another. Japan's most visible post-war drug emergency centred on stimulants from 1946 through 1954, but that stimulant crisis existed in the same broader atmosphere of pharmaceutical leakage, black market exchange, and weakened social control that also mattered for narcotics. This does not mean post-war Japan was drowning in heroin before the Korean War. We should be precise. The major domestic heroin crisis in Japan came later, especially from the mid-1950s into the early 1960s. But precision does not make the earlier period irrelevant. What existed before 1950 was a ready environment: excess military drugs, criminal opportunity, urban scarcity, illicit exchange, and a population already confronting the social consequences of dependence-producing substances. The official Japanese review drew a clear sequence. Before 1945, there had been relatively little domestic addiction in Japan. After the war, the picture changed sharply, first through stimulants, and then, later, through heroin. That matters because American troops entering occupation Japan were not stepping into an untouched society. They were stepping into one whose relationship with modern drugs was already becoming unstable. now placed the American soldier inside that setting. The occupation of Japan was not a quiet diplomatic abstraction. It was barracks, depots, railheads, clubs, entertainment districts, ports, and a steady circulation of men who had been uprooted from ordinary life. By the Army's own later medical account, alcohol and narcotic drugs were readily available to occupation forces in the Far East before the Korean War began. Liquor could be purchased cheaply, and narcotics were also obtainable at reduced prices in Japan. The same source noted that heroin addiction had already been observed among soldiers stationed near major seaports, especially Yokohama and Kobe. There it is, stated plainly in an official military history. The Korean War did not introduce heroin to American troops in East Asia. Some troops had already encountered it before the first shots were fired in Korea. Yokohama and Kobe were not random dots on a map. Ports have always had a particular personality. People arrive without routes and leave without being known. Goods appear from far away. Rules are harder to enforce than they look on paper. Money changes hands quickly. A soldier on a weekend pass in a port city experiences a form of freedom that can feel almost artificial. He is in uniform, but he is not on the line. He is watched, but not closely. He is young, paid, anonymous, and often surrounded by other young men who are trying to show they are tougher, more experienced, less homesick than they really are. A place like that does not create addiction by itself, but it lowers the distance between temptation and access. When official army observers pointed to Yokohama and Kobe, they were identifying a social environment as much as a geography. It is also worth remembering that Korea itself had not been separate from these older narcotic systems. Jennings's study of colonial Korea emphasized that the peninsula's role in opium and narcotics production became substantial in the decades before liberation. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal later identified Korea as a principal source of opium and narcotics around the time of the Mukden incident and thereafter. That does not mean the Korea of 1950 was simply an unbroken continuation of colonial-era production. War, liberation, division, and political upheaval changed everything. But networks, expertise, and expectations do not disappear overnight. When US forces moved into Korea, they entered a country that had already been exposed to a long history of drug production and circulation under Japanese rule. That history formed part of the background noise of the war, even when soldiers themselves knew nothing about it. Here is the part that can be easy to miss if we think only in military categories. Armies move through economies, they do not float above them. When large numbers of troops arrive in a region, local markets adjust. Some markets sell food, some sell laundry, some sell companionship, some sell liquor, some sell drugs. Every army tries to regulate this, and every army discovers that desire travels faster than regulation. By 1950, American forces in the Far East had already been living alongside these markets for years. That meant word-of-mouth knowledge existed. Men knew which neighborhoods had cheap drink. Some knew where narcotics could be found. Others did not know at first, but they could learn in an evening. The Korean War added urgency, traffic, and stress to a system that was already functioning. There is no need to exaggerate the scale to see the danger. The Army medical history insisted that alcohol and narcotic offenders were a relatively minor problem compared with the vast logistical burdens of the Korean campaign. That is an important caution, because it keeps us from making the war sound as though it were consumed by addiction. It was not. Most soldiers were not addicts. Most were occupied with surviving, serving, and getting home. But the same source also called the issue a constant and ominous concern to commanders, especially in Japan and Rear Korea. Both things can be true at once. A problem can affect a minority and still reveal something important about the conditions surrounding everyone. Consider what a young soldier might carry into that world before he ever set foot on a battlefield. He might be 18, 19, 20. He might have grown up in a small town where the most dangerous vice he knew by sight was a tavern. Now he found himself in occupied Japan, surrounded by foreign languages, foreign money, hard drinking, rumours, and places where older soldiers seemed to know the rules. He learned quickly that some men bought things they were not supposed to buy. He learned that enforcement came and went. He learned that a substance could be offered not as a descent into ruin, but as a novelty, a way to feel good, a way to prove he was not naive. Addiction rarely begins with someone announcing that he is about to destroy himself. More often, it begins with the belief that this one experience is small enough to control. The regional drug world made that first mistake easier to make. The stimulant problem in Japan helps explain the wider atmosphere. United Nations drug control literature described the post-war stimulant wave as spreading among younger people and becoming a major social problem in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The Japanese scholar Miriam Kingsburg later argued that the Hieropon crisis came to symbolise the traumatised and dependent condition of a defeated nation. That detail matters even though heroin is the substance most directly associated with the Korean War story. It shows that post-war Japan was already confronting the social meaning of drug dependence before the US military's narcotics concern intensified. People had seen what modern chemicals could do when discipline collapsed and markets adapted. The country was not merely rebuilding roads and ministries, it was trying to regain control over bodies and habits as well. Occupation policy recognised the need for control early, but control on paper is never the same thing as control on the ground. SCAPIN 130 froze narcotic stocks and banned manufacture and export without authorization, yet the later historical record still shows a post-war environment in which drugs circulated, offences occurred near bases, and US troops found narcotics in port cities. The existence of regulation does not disprove the existence of a market. Often it proves that officials understood the market was dangerous enough to require immediate attention, and in a society still recovering from defeat, with shortages and fractured institutions, the people tasked with enforcement were operating inside a situation that changed faster than any directive could fully contain. There is one more point worth making before we move closer to the soldiers themselves. The drug world waiting in East Asia was not merely a criminal backdrop. It was tied to empire, medicine, war and recovery. Korea's colonial-era narcotics production had served Japanese imperial interests. Post-war Japan's stimulant crisis emerged in part from substances that had circulated during wartime and then entered civilian life after defeat. Occupation authorities responded with control measures, but American troops stationed in Japan still encountered cheap alcohol and available narcotics. In other words, the Korean War addiction story grew from several histories converging at once. Colonial drug economies had not fully disappeared. Wartime pharmaceutical systems had spilled into civilian markets. Post-war disorder had opened spaces for trafficking. Military occupation had brought thousands of young Americans into direct contact with that world. That is why the story cannot begin only with a soldier shaking in a bunker or lying awake after an artillery barrage. By then, the setting had already been built. The alley, the port, the cellar, the rumour, the cheap drink, the sense that the rules were looser here than they had been back home, all of it existed before combat stress pushed certain men closer to the edge. The battlefield would matter greatly, but it would matter because it pressed upon soldiers, who were already moving through a region where chemical escape was available. When the Korean War widened and American units began cycling through rear areas, ports, and rest centres, the older drug world of East Asia would stop being distant context and start becoming a personal risk for men in uniform. A drug market can exist for years without touching a particular person. What matters is contact. What matters is the moment when a young man, far from home, worn down by waiting, or fear, or simple boredom, finds himself standing in a place where relief can be bought quickly, and where almost no one who knows him is nearby to say, "That is not who you are." For American soldiers in the Korean War, that contact often began well away from the firing line. It began in rear camps, replacement depots, transport ports, railroad stations, temporary billets, and Japanese cities that stood between the battlefield and the life they had left behind. Japan was not merely nearby during the Korean War. It functioned as a rear base for the United Nations war effort, linking the Korean peninsula to supply routes, hospitals, transit centres, and embarkation ports. The sea lanes and air routes between Korea and Japan were the invisible machinery that kept the conflict moving, and Japanese ports became some of the most important hinges in that system. This is one of those details that changes the way the war looks once you notice it. The Korean War was fought in Korea, but a great deal of its daily military life spilled into Japan. Men arrived through one port, processed through a camp, boarded trains, waited for orders, moved onward by ship or aircraft, and then sometimes came back months later thinner, quieter, or carrying wounds that had not yet been named. Sasebo, Yokohama, Kobe, Hakata, and other ports were not background scenery. They were crowded military arteries. Japanese port facilities received and dispatched soldiers, ammunition, supplies, hospital ships, and refugees. Hakata, for example, became a major transport base near the Korean peninsula, with trucks moving wounded soldiers from the port toward US military hospitals. Sasebo served as a refuge point, naval base, and transport hub, while Yokohama and Kobe remained critical points of passage and supply. Now picture the experience from the soldier's side. He has left home, crossed an ocean, and entered a war that still does not make complete sense to him. He may not know Korea's history. He may not know where he will be sent next. He does know that he has spent days in motion and nights in barracks or on transport. He knows his letters arrive slowly. He knows the faces around him keep changing as units move, replacements arrive, and men rotate away. In combat, he is terrified but occupied. In transit, he is left with himself. That difference matters more than we sometimes admit. A man under fire has immediate tasks. A man waiting in a rear camp has time to think about home, time to notice who has stopped writing, time to count how many days have passed since he last heard his own name spoken by someone who loved him before the uniform. The Army's own wartime medical observers understood that overseas separation created emotional strain. In discussing alcohol problems among personnel in the Far East Command, Colonel Albert J. Glass described one pattern of excessive drinking as a flight reaction connected to overseas separation, frustration in work, guilt, or other sources of tension. His language belongs to the 1950s, but the experience underneath it is easy enough to recognise. Some men were not simply drinking because the bottle was nearby. They were drinking because something in them had become difficult to sit with in silence. A rear camp could make that silence louder, not softer. There is a temptation to think of rear areas as safe places, and compared with the front, of course they were. A port city in Japan was safer than a ridge under artillery fire. A transit camp was safer than a night patrol. But safety is not the same thing as peace. Rear areas could be disorienting in their own way because they stood halfway between worlds. The soldier was no longer fully inside combat, but he was not home either. He might sleep in a proper bed for the first time in months, then wake before dawn because his body had not yet remembered how to trust quiet. He might bathe, shave, put on a clean uniform, and look almost like the person he had been before Korea, even if he no longer felt much like him. The military called some of these spaces rest centres and R&R centres because that is what they were designed to provide. Yet relief is not always simple when the mind has not arrived at the same place as the body. The rest and recuperation system made Japan a major emotional destination for soldiers in Korea. The National Museum of the United States Air Force notes that the 5th Air Force carried personnel from Korea to Japan, often from Seoul to Tachikawa near Tokyo, for brief periods of leave. Many went onward to Tokyo or Japanese resort areas, and the program eventually gave more than 800,000 combat-weary United Nations personnel a short chance to step away from the war. An army medical account described R&R centres in Japan where troops were processed, bathed, issued clean uniforms and then released for several days of leave. Those details are revealing. The military understood that men needed restoration not only through sleep, but through the return of ordinary civilian comforts, a shower, fresh clothing, a meal eaten slowly, perhaps a hotel bed, perhaps an evening in a city with music, lights, and no mortar rounds in the distance. But the same system that offered relief also placed large numbers of lonely, tired men into urban environments built to profit from them. The Army Medical Report on Venereal Disease, written shortly after the war, described how pimps and prostitutes clustered around R&R centres despite repeated suppression efforts. In Sasebo, where replacements passed through, on their way to Korea and rotaties returned on their way home, the local sex trade expanded sharply with wartime troop movement. The same report states that a commanding officer estimated the prostitute population there in December 1950 at between 6,000 and 10,000, most of them streetwalkers. A separate Japanese port study noted that the number of women attending soldiers and taking part in nightlife around Sasebo rose dramatically between 1949 and 1950. These are not pleasant details, but they matter because they reveal how quickly wartime demand reshaped city life around troops. Where soldiers concentrated, commercial vice followed. The army medical language of the time could be blunt and often reflected the assumptions of its era, especially when discussing companionship and prostitution. Still, one observation remains central to understanding the loneliness of American servicemen in Japan, Okinawa, and Korea. Army physicians argued that many soldiers lacked ordinary social companionship with local women because of language barriers, cultural distance, and the understandable reluctance of families to see their daughters associate with foreign troops. In their assessment, this left many men seeking female company within the commercial sex economy, rather than through ordinary social life. That analysis was shaped by the values of the period, and it certainly does not describe every soldier, every woman, or every local community. But it does show that military authorities recognised an emotional vacuum around the troops, not just a disciplinary problem. And emotional vacuums matter. A man does not have to be weak to crave conversation. He does not have to be reckless to want to be touched. He does not have to be immoral to feel lonely in a foreign country where he cannot easily speak to anyone outside the barracks. The danger begins when every ordinary need arrives in a setting where money is the easiest language. A drink can be bought, company can be bought, a few hours of numbness can be bought. In rear areas, especially around ports and leave centres, desire and commerce stood close together. That did not make every soldier a customer of vice, and it did not make every vice lead to addiction. But it created a setting in which the search for comfort became entangled with markets that had no reason to protect the men using them. The contrast with combat zones is striking. Colonel Glass observed that alcohol and narcotic offenders were of greatest concern among troops stationed in Japan and in rear Korea, while combat units were far less involved unless they remained in rear areas for extended periods. That point is worth sitting with. We often assume the worst emotional damage must be expressed closest to the fighting. Sometimes it is, but access matters, opportunity matters, group behaviour matters. A soldier in a frontline foxhole may be too busy, surviving to indulge in a habit, even if he is miserable. A soldier in a rear camp near a port city may have the time, the money, the company, and the supply. The mind may be equally burdened in both places. The difference is that one environment offers a more immediate route toward intoxication. That distinction helps explain why port cities loom so large in this history. Yokohama and Kobe had already been identified before the Korean War as places where American soldiers encountered heroin more frequently. Busan became another area of concern once the conflict began. Glass wrote that the highest incidence of narcotic offenders appeared in the vicinity of Yokohama and Kobe before the war, and that the outbreak of hostilities added Busan to the list. He also noted that drug use seemed most common in places where narcotics were readily available through prostitutes, small shops, nightclubs, and entertainment venues. Again, this is not a claim that these areas were simply dens of corruption, or that every business participated. It is a statement about exposure. Soldiers who passed through certain places were more likely to encounter substances that men elsewhere might never see. Busan especially deserves attention because it sits inside a different emotional atmosphere from the Japanese rear base. Japan was behind the war. Busan was inside Korea, and during the first months of the conflict it became a lifeline under pressure. Men arrived there during crisis, supplies poured through, wounded men passed out, replacements moved in, officers tried to keep the machinery functioning, while everyone understood that the front was not impossibly far away. In such a place, a rear area did not feel fully separate from battle. It felt more like a crowded waiting room beside it. The Army medical history names Busan as a serious area of narcotic concern during the conflict, and that detail becomes more understandable when we picture the human atmosphere of a city tied so closely to arrival, departure, fear, and uncertainty. There is a specific kind of loneliness that belongs to military transit. It is different from ordinary homesickness. Homesickness imagines return. Transit loneliness comes from never settling anywhere long enough to feel present. 1 week a man is at Camp Drake near Tokyo. Then he is moving by rail towards Sasebo. Then he is on a ship to Korea. Later, if he survives long enough and receives leave, he may be flown back to Japan for a few days, cleaned up, and pushed into a city where everything seems bright, temporary, and slightly unreal. The Army report on Sasebo describes exactly this chain of movement. Replacements entered through Yokohama, processed at Camp Drake, then travelled to Sasebo before shipping onward to Korea. Troops rotating back to the United States also came through Sasebo. The city became a revolving door of men going into war and men trying to leave it behind. A revolving door is a difficult place to build restraint. No one is quite staying. No one is quite accountable in the way they might be at home or in a long-term post. There is always a sense that this night does not count because tomorrow everything changes. This is how men end up doing things on leave they might never have imagined doing in another life. Not because they have lost all judgment, but because temporary worlds encourage temporary thinking. The port city whispers that the evening is borrowed time. The camp pass says you will be gone soon. The war says you may not get another chance. Those messages do not have to be spoken aloud to shape behaviour. The military attempted to provide organised recreation for exactly this reason. Special services arranged hotels and recreational facilities for men on R&R. The broader R&R system itself was intended as a morale measure, and there is no question that it helped many soldiers endure the war. A man who had spent months in cold positions or punishing movement across Korea might return refreshed enough to keep functioning after a few days away. But official recreation had limits. It could offer a bed, a bath, and a room in a hotel. It could not always offer belonging. It could not put a soldier back at his family dinner table. It could not replace the woman he planned to marry, the child who had learned new words while he was overseas, or the father whose letters were getting shorter because he did not know what else to say. The gap between physical rest and emotional restoration remained, and in that gap alcohol and narcotics found room. Alcohol came first for many men because alcohol was open, common, and culturally familiar. Glass noted that tax-exempt American whiskey and local spirits were cheaply available to occupation troops before the Korean War, making social drinking common among officers and enlisted men. Once war began, that existing pattern did not disappear. If anything, it entered a harsher environment. Heavy drinking could be passed off as celebration after surviving a bad stretch, as bonding among men, as a harmless reward during leave. It was much easier to excuse than heroin. That matters because the habit of turning to a substance for relief does not always begin with the most dangerous substance in the room. Sometimes it begins with the one everyone already accepts. Narcotics entered through narrower doors, but the doors were there. The Army medical history described vulnerable newcomers being introduced to opiates by users within their own units, and it described clusters of narcotic users forming in areas where drugs were available. That is one of the more revealing details in the record. Addiction did not always arrive through a mysterious stranger in a shadowy alley. Sometimes it arrived through another soldier, someone who already knew where to go, what to ask for, how to make the first experience seem ordinary. Group behaviour softened the warning signs. If several men in the barracks were using, the habit could begin to look less like a disaster and more like another forbidden recreation. The rear camp, unlike the front line, gave those groups more opportunity to form. This is why loneliness and companionship cannot be treated as sentimental side issues. They shaped risk. They influenced how a man spent leave, whom he followed, whether he drank too much, whether he entered places where drugs circulated, whether he felt embarrassed to refuse what others accepted. A man with a letter from home in his pocket and a trusted friend beside him might walk past a doorway that another man entered. A man who had just received bad news, or no news at all, might keep walking until someone offered him a reason to stop. History cannot reconstruct every decision, but it can reconstruct the circumstances in which decisions became harder. Rear camps and port cities also made the war feel uneven. Some soldiers went forward while others stayed behind for support duties. Some men were wounded and sent back. Some were returning to the United States. Some were replacements who had not yet seen combat and were trying to appear unafraid. That mixture could produce its own tensions. The veteran might drink to forget. The newcomer might drink to prove himself. The man working in a logistical role might feel guilt for being away from the front, even if his duty was essential. Glass explicitly listed guilt and frustration in work among the tensions associated with problematic drinking. That reminder keeps us from flattening the emotional world of the war into a single experience. Men suffered for different reasons, and some of those reasons were hardest to explain precisely because they did not fit the heroic image of combat. There is another image from the port study that deserves a place here because it captures the strangeness of these Japanese cities during the war. Japanese ports benefited economically from military demand. Employment rose. Service industries expanded. Yet the same ports also saw heightened security fears, the regular arrival of wounded and dead soldiers, and local anxiety about disorder associated with troops before they went to the front. Prosperity and unease sat side by side. A bar might be full at night while, not far away, another ship arrived carrying men who would never walk out of a hospital on their own. That proximity between pleasure and death is not incidental. It gives the rear area its uneasy charge. Soldiers felt it, civilians felt it. The war may have been across the water, but it was also unloading at the pier. Imagine one of those evenings in Sasebo or Yokohama. A soldier has been processed, inspected, and briefly turned loose. His uniform is cleaner than it has been in months. He has cash. He has several hours before he needs to be back. The street feels lively in a way the battlefield never does. There are signs he cannot read, music spilling from a doorway, other servicemen laughing too loudly, locals who know exactly what kind of customer he might be. He tells himself he will only have a drink. Perhaps he does only have a drink. Perhaps that is where the story ends for him. But another man goes farther. He follows someone he trusts or wants to impress. He sees a substance passed across a table or prepared in a room above a shop. He hesitates. Then he remembers he is exhausted, lonely, and going back to Korea soon. The decision does not feel monumental in the moment. That is the danger. What this environment created was not inevitability, but susceptibility. The ports did not force addiction. The R&R system did not create it by itself. Rear camps did not poison men simply by existing. But these spaces gathered together several conditions that made substance use more likely. Distance from home, surplus waiting, emotional strain, loosened routines, access to alcohol, access to narcotics in specific districts, and peer groups that could normalize risky behavior. When the official army record tells us that rear areas and Japanese stations caused more concern than frontline units, it is pointing toward exactly this convergence. Addiction became more likely where vulnerability met availability, and where the war briefly loosened its grip without truly letting a man go. And once soldiers began searching for relief in those spaces, the substances themselves took on distinct roles. Alcohol could blur an evening. Heroin could quiet the body and mind more completely. Some men wanted sleep. Some wanted calm. Some wanted the temporary feeling that distance from home, fear of return to the front, and memories from the last patrol had all stepped outside the room for a little while. The port city offered the setting. The rear camp prolonged the waiting. Loneliness made the offer easier to hear. The next part of the story lies in what those men found when relief came in a bottle, a pipe, or a needle, and why certain forms of escape proved far more difficult to leave behind than they first appeared. By the time a soldier found himself in a rear camp, a port city, or one of the crowded entertainment districts that grew around the war, the search for relief had usually begun long before any bottle was opened or any packet changed holders that would not lower after weeks of tension, in the eyes that kept scanning even in a safe room, in the sleep that never arrived cleanly, in the half-finished letter home that sat in a pocket because the soldier did not know how to explain the last month without frightening the people who loved him. Relief, in that setting, was not a luxury. It felt like a necessity. The question was only what form it would take, and how much of it a man could use before the thing that helped him briefly began to claim him more fully. Army physicians who later examined alcohol and narcotic problems in the Far East Command repeatedly connected excessive use to tension, overseas separation, frustration, and the strains of wartime service, was the most familiar answer. It did not need to be explained. It did not arrive with the stigma of heroin. It belonged to barracks culture, to celebrations, to payday evenings, to the language of men who often preferred joking to confession. Before the Korean War even began, American personnel in the Far East could buy tax-exempt American whiskey and local spirits at prices well below what they would have paid in the United States, and Army observers noted that social drinking was common among officers and enlisted men alike. That detail matters because by 1950, alcohol was not entering military life as a new temptation. It was already part of the social world surrounding occupation troops in Japan, and the war added fresh reasons to lean on it. A man coming off a troop transport or stepping into a Japanese city during leave. His uniform is clean again. His boots have been polished. He is shaved properly for the first time in days. He's sitting with other men at a small table under harsh electric light, and there is a bottle between them. At first, the drink may be almost ceremonial. Proof that the night belongs to them and not to the army. Proof that for a few hours no officer is shouting, no artillery is sounding, no truck is moving them toward a place they would rather not go. The first glass warms the throat. The second loosens the conversation. The third makes the room seem less sharp around the edges. A letter from home becomes easier to discuss. A dead friend becomes easier not to discuss. Alcohol did not always mean collapse. Often it meant one evening in which the soldier felt briefly less guarded than he had been in weeks. That is part of why it was so powerful. The Army medical account used language that is almost plain enough to hurt. It described alcohol misuse as a way of seeking temporary relief from deeper psychological and social difficulties, and it observed that the stresses of combat and overseas existence gave men more opportunities to use alcohol as an anodyne for tension. That word anodyne means something that eases pain. It is an old word, and a useful one here. For many soldiers, alcohol was not only recreation, it was pain relief for feelings no one had trained them to name. The mind does not always separate fear, shame, grief, boredom, and anger neatly. Sometimes it only knows that it wants the pressure reduced. P.S. explain why drinking could become heavier in places that were not under fire. A man at the front might be too occupied, too closely watched, or too exhausted in a practical sense to drink himself senseless. A man in a rear area had more room, more time, more company, more excuses. He could tell himself he had earned it. Everyone around him might agree. If he became loud, someone laughed. If he missed morning formation once, perhaps there was grumbling, perhaps a punishment, perhaps nothing. Patterns begin gently when the surrounding culture has already decided they are normal. The official army history did not treat alcohol problems as identical to narcotic addiction, but it did recognise that they were shaped by the same theatre conditions: distance from home, stress, and a ready supply. Just another danger in Korea that made the search for a drink more hazardous than it might appear. Reputable liquor was often less available in Korea than in Japan during the first year of the war. An army toxicologist reported that some locally produced beverages contained dangerous substances, including methanol and other toxic mixtures. In one brief period in early 1951, 12 deaths from native whiskies occurred in the Seoul area, prompting extraordinary searches of military vehicles leaving the city and confiscation of alcohol-containing fluids. The Far East Command also documented deaths from methanol poisoning in Korea, including 6 deaths connected to one drinking party aboard a ship. Even the effort to numb the evening could become fatal before addiction entered the picture at all. Ale deserves a moment because it reveals something about desperation and improvisation in wartime markets. Men wanted liquor. Civilians wanted money. Supply gaps existed. Someone filled them. The bottles could look convincing. The labels could look respectable enough to fool a tired soldier who had no reason to suspect that a night's drink might contain poison. War creates shortages, but it also creates customers who are willing to take chances. A man who would never gamble with an unknown bottle at home might do so in Seoul because the conditions of his life have already taught him that tomorrow is not guaranteed. The lines between caution and resignation can become thin in a war zone. Heroin occupied a different place. It was not as broadly accepted as alcohol, and it did not have the cover of ordinary social custom. Yet it offered something alcohol could not. Alcohol blurred. Heroin promised stillness. As a rapidly acting opioid derived from morphine, heroin is associated with intense pleasurable effects, drowsiness, and a strong addictive potential. Modern drug agencies describe it as highly addictive, and army physicians in the Korean theatre plainly identified heroin as the dominant opiate of concern among military narcotic offenders. The soldier who reached for heroin was not merely joining a round of drinks. He was seeking a more complete interruption of distress, whether he understood that fully or not. Cheol Korean War medical history gives us a chilling glimpse of how heroin moved through troop communities. It says that vulnerable newcomers were initiated into opiate use by soldiers already using within the unit. It also reports that user groups formed, traded methods of avoiding work and detection, and normalised narcotic use in ways that resembled how alcoholism could be condoned in certain environments. That is a very different image from the solitary addict hidden away from the world. In these wartime settings, heroin could become social before it became private. A young man did not always find it alone. Sometimes he found it through comrades, which made refusal more complicated. In a military environment where belonging mattered, where no one wanted to look frightened or naive, the invitation could carry more force than the substance itself. Something especially dangerous about relief that arrives through friendship. A stranger offering heroin can be dismissed as dangerous. A man from your own unit offering it is harder to judge. He has been through the same mud, the same insults, the same cold, perhaps the same incoming fire. He may seem confident. He may insist it is not a big thing. He may say it helps you sleep, or that it makes the nerves settle, or that officers exaggerate the danger because officers exaggerate everything. That is often how harm enters a group, not through obvious malice, but through trust misdirected. The army doctors did not write in that emotional language, but their observations of unit-based initiation make the underlying pattern clear. And war record also shows why authorities struggled to recognise the seriousness of early heroin use. Known users confined in psychiatric wards often displayed little or no obvious withdrawal, and army physicians suggested that many were either in an early stage of addiction, using low doses, or indulging only periodically on weekends or at parties. Investigators searched for needle scars not only on forearms but also on feet, legs, buttocks, and the abdomen, yet even visible signs could be explained away. Some young users lacked the severe weight loss or other obvious physical stigmata associated with long-term addiction. In other words, a man could already be involved with heroin and still look, at a glance, like any other tired serviceman. Iguity mattered because a few hours of relief can look harmless when the consequences have not yet arrived. A soldier who used once and then again weeks later might not think of himself as an addict. A unit commander might suspect trouble but lack proof. A friend might notice something has changed but feel that informing would be disloyal. The Army medical history observed that non-users, including senior non-commissioned officers in some units, sometimes feared reporting narcotic users or decided that it was a police matter rather than their concern. Silence gave the habit room to grow. It also allowed men to tell themselves that if no one was stopping them, the danger could not be as serious as the lectures claimed. There were the men who had not arrived innocent of drugs at all. Army observers reported that it was not unusual to find chronic addicts who had used narcotics since their teenage years and had passed into military service without revealing it. One man, they wrote, re-enlisted and requested an assignment to Busan because narcotics were cheaper there than in the United States. This is an extraordinary detail, not because it represented the typical soldier, but because it shows how wartime zones could attract pre-existing addiction rather than merely create new addiction. In certain units, these experienced users could become the nucleus around which new user groups formed. War did not always invent the problem. Sometimes it assembled the right conditions for an old problem to spread. Attraction in that environment becomes easier to understand when placed beside alcohol. Alcohol kept a man in the room. He laughed louder, argued more, slept badly, woke sick, and often returned to himself by morning. Heroin offered a different kind of departure. It could quiet the restless body and narrow the world to a small enclosed feeling of ease. For a man who had been carrying dread in his stomach all day, that contrast may have felt enormous. We should not romanticize it. Heroin was dangerous, illegal, and capable of drawing users into dependence with brutal speed. But if we want to understand why someone used it, we have to acknowledge what it seemed to provide in the moment. The person reaching for a dangerous drug is not always seeking destruction. Sometimes he is seeking one evening without himself. Zone account noted occasional deaths from opiate overdoses, particularly heroin. Toxicologists in the Far East Command also documented deaths associated with sedatives taken alongside heroin and other situations in which sedation prevented a person from responding to danger. Those findings remind us that the line between temporary relief and physical catastrophe could be narrow. A soldier might think he was repeating an experience he had already survived. The amount might differ. The purity might differ. Another drug might already be in his system. The room might be hot, crowded, poorly ventilated. A body already exhausted by war does not always tolerate what a reckless mind expects it to tolerate, had its own pattern of destruction. The Army medical history described cases involving liver disease, transient psychotic disorders, severe intoxication, and violent rage reactions followed by claimed amnesia. These were not every drinker's story, but they were part of the command's reality. A substance that began as a shared evening release could eventually place a man in a hospital ward, in disciplinary trouble, or in a state where returning to duty only restarted the cycle. The same medical observers noted that hospital improvement was often temporary, and that return to duty was frequently followed by recurrence of the alcohol habit. Relief had a way of becoming routine, and routine had a way of becoming dependence. SI to speak about drinking and narcotics as separate worlds, because one stood in the open and the other more often in hiding. But for soldiers searching for relief, the emotional purpose could overlap. Both offered a pause. Both interrupted the normal demands of vigilance. Both let men postpone for a little while the letters, memories, and expectations waiting for them. Alcohol was more familiar and more socially permitted. Heroin was more concentrated, more secretive, and more alarming to commanders. Yet both entered the same larger question. What happens when men are placed under sustained stress without reliable ways to process it, and then given easy access to substances that alter consciousness? That question becomes even more serious when we remember how the Korean War unfolded. It was not a conflict of steady, predictable movement. It contained retreat, rapid advance, Chinese intervention, bitter winter combat, static hill fighting, and long periods of uncertainty over whether negotiations would end the war or simply stretch the waiting further. Soldiers did not always know whether they were preparing for an offensive, holding a line, rotating out, or going back into a place that had already taken men they knew. Relief became tempting not only after fear, but before it. A drink could steady a man who dreaded returning to duty. A drug could make the anticipation recede. The army physicians described the theatrical use of alcohol and narcotics in rear areas, but beneath their clinical language was a broader reality. Anticipation itself can exhaust a person. To think addiction follows pain, and often it does. But sometimes it follows the expectation of pain. The soldier knows what tomorrow may contain. He has seen enough to understand. That can be almost as wearing as the thing itself. Sitting in a port city or camp waiting for orders, his body is no longer running, yet his mind has not stopped. The bottle and the opiate each offer a form of interruption. Not healing, not even true rest. Interruption. That is the bargain. An interruption is very seductive when experience has become too continuous. The official army observers were plainly troubled by how easily opiate use could become woven into unit life once it appeared. They noted that availability, assignment to particular places, and association with groups that fostered antisocial conduct were central to whether vulnerable men became narcotic users. The same individual, they argued, might not become addicted if sent to a combat zone or any area where drugs were unavailable and the group did not tolerate their use. That observation is powerful because it pushes us away from the idea that addiction was only a matter of personal character. Environment mattered, access mattered, group norms mattered. Relief was not sought in a vacuum, a modern instinct to sort people very quickly into categories. Responsible or irresponsible, strong or weak, disciplined or undisciplined. History is less cooperative. A soldier might show courage under fire and still drink himself into a stupor on leave. Another might fulfill his duties day after day while quietly beginning a heroin habit that no one detects at first. Another might reject both, write letters, pray, gamble, exercise, or simply endure in silence. Human beings do not respond to stress in identical ways. That variety should make us careful, especially when looking backward at men who lived in circumstances most of us will never encounter. What the Korean War reveals at this point is not simply that drugs were present. It reveals that certain substances matched certain needs. Alcohol fit the open, communal culture of relief. It was easy to share, easy to justify, and dangerous partly because it was ordinary. Heroin fit the more hidden desire to disappear inward, to turn down the mind, to exchange alertness for a private chamber of calm. It was dangerous partly because it was not ordinary, because the man who used it had to step across a line and then often had to keep crossing it in secrecy. The army worried about both because both could damage readiness, health, and discipline. But the soldiers who used them were not usually thinking in those terms. They were thinking about tonight, about sleep, about getting through the next few hours, is what makes this history so unsettling. Addiction rarely introduces itself as a permanent visitor. It arrives as assistance. One bottle to soften the evening. One experiment because someone you trust says it is manageable. One dose because the next day seems unbearable. one night because you are tired of remembering. The Korean War gave some soldiers many reasons to crave relief, and too many places where relief was sold in forms that could turn against them. The front line mattered, of course, because it created the strain, but the rear areas revealed what men sometimes did with that strain once they were briefly released from immediate duty. The next layer of this story lies inside the nervous system itself, in the combat shock, exhaustion, and emotional overload that made escape feel less like indulgence and more like a form of survival. Because the substances did not create the emptiness on their own. They found it waiting. There is a moment in war that rarely appears in paintings or patriotic posters. It is not the charge, not the salute, not the flag going up, not the officer pointing toward a hill and telling men they have to take it. It is the moment after a body has obeyed for too long. The soldier is still standing, perhaps. He may still answer when spoken to. He may still hold his rifle correctly. But something inside him has stopped keeping pace with the orders being given. His thoughts arrive late. His hands move without confidence. His face looks wrong to the men who know him. Not cowardly, not lazy, wrong. In Korea, military psychiatrists and aid men had words for some of this. They spoke of combat exhaustion, combat fatigue, dissociative reactions, and men who had reached a point where fear, loss and fatigue were no longer being contained by discipline alone. That inner collapse did not automatically produce addiction, and it would be false to pretend that every exhausted soldier reached for alcohol or heroin. But it created a kind of vulnerability that matters deeply to our story. Because when the mind becomes desperate for relief, anything that promises relief begins to look different. The Korean War produced this kind of strain early and intensely. The first phase of the conflict was a period of rapid retreat, emergency reinforcement, and confused movement under pressure. Army medical historians later emphasized that the earliest fighting created exactly the tactical situation that produced large numbers of psychiatric casualties, new units thrown into heavy combat, little time for rest, severe battle losses, and a constantly shifting front. By early August 1950, after the United Nations forces had contracted into the Busan perimeter, the incidence of psychiatric casualties reached its highest level of the campaign. This was not because soldiers had suddenly become fragile. It was because they were being asked to endure more instability than most human beings can process cleanly. They were fighting delaying actions, watching positions fall, trying to hold together units that had not yet built the cohesion of long-shared hardship, and doing all of this while the war itself still felt frighteningly uncertain. It is difficult for us, sitting in rooms where the temperature is controlled and the lights come on with a switch, to understand how fully physical hardship feeds mental strain. Korea was not only dangerous, it was punishing to inhabit. Soldiers dealt with cold, mud, heat, exhaustion, hunger, irregular sleep, and the constant inconvenience of living outdoors under military conditions that did not pause simply because a man had reached his limit. Official army reflections on the war repeatedly distinguished between the stress of actual combat and the stress of living in primitive field conditions day after day. That distinction matters. A soldier did not have to be firing his rifle every minute to be worn down. He could be soaked, sleepless, dirty, hungry, and waiting. He could be carrying the expectation of attack through a night when no attack came. Sometimes the waiting used up almost as much of him as the fighting. When we hear the phrase combat exhaustion, it can sound almost mild, as though someone is merely tired and needs a nap. The army psychiatrists who worked in Korea meant something more serious. They described reactions ranging from mild to severe dissociative states that occurred during periods of active fighting. Aid men, who often saw these changes first, developed their own field understanding of what was happening to riflemen. One observer described a reaction among experienced soldiers marked by a glassy-eyed stare, a grim, almost fearsome expression, and moments of reckless exposure that could still appear purposeful from the outside. Think about that carefully. A man may continue moving toward danger, and yet his mind may no longer be operating in a normal way. Combat shock does not always announce itself through trembling and retreat. Sometimes it appears as a frightening kind of automatic forward motion. The human body is not built to remain in a state of alarm without consequence. In battle, adrenaline can help a man act. It can sharpen vision, increase speed, dull pain for a short while. But the same system becomes damaging when it has nowhere to go and no chance to settle. Korean War psychiatry did not use today's language of trauma in the same way we do, and the formal diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder would not appear until decades later. Yet the doctors in Korea plainly recognised that men could be pushed into states of breakdown by the cumulative effects of fear, death, and battlefield instability. They also recognised that these states had to be treated close to the front, with rest, reassurance, sedation in some cases, and the expectation that many men could recover enough to return to duty. The treatment philosophy of the era was intensely practical. It focused less on long-term healing than on stabilising the soldier quickly and preserving manpower. That last point is important because it tells us something about the emotional culture surrounding soldiers. The army did not ignore combat breakdown, but it looked at it through the needs of the war. Men were often treated with the hope that they would go back to their units in a matter of days, and many did. Army observers believe that keeping psychiatric casualties close to the front helped prevent them from settling into a sense of permanent disability and preserved their bond with their units. By far the majority of combat psychiatric casualties, one psychiatrist wrote, could be returned to duty within a few days, though he admitted that long-term follow-up was badly lacking. That admission matters. The system knew how to get many men moving again. It knew much less about what those men carried with them after they resumed functioning. There is a difference between a man who is restored and a man who is made usable again. The Korean War often required the latter. A soldier might sleep, eat, speak with a psychiatrist briefly, regain his composure, and rejoin his unit. From the military perspective, that could be a success. From the human perspective, it might be only a pause in a much larger struggle. Some men recovered fully enough. Others may have returned with the same fear now layered beneath a fresh determination not to show it. The record itself suggests uncertainty. Army psychiatrists knew that many returned to duty, but they did not always know what happened to them months or years later. That gap is one reason the addiction story deserves care. A soldier might appear to recover from combat exhaustion, and still carry an unresolved need for relief that would surface later in a rear area, a leave town, or a bottle pressed into his hand. That is an inference, not a direct one-to-one claim, but it follows from the documented combination of combat strain and the Army's own recognition that alcohol offered temporary relief from psychological and social tension. The Korean battlefield also attacked one of the most basic psychological protections soldiers relied upon, the belief that danger falls elsewhere. A psychiatrist who studied rifle squads in Korea observed that men were intensely preoccupied with personal invulnerability. They could admit that someone would get it, but underneath that statement lived the hope that the someone would be another man, not themselves. This is not stupidity, it is survival. No one can move through sustained danger if he fully feels, every second, that he may be mutilated or killed at any moment. The mind builds small barriers against that truth. It tells itself that careful men survive, that experienced men survive, that buddies survive together. And then one of those barriers breaks. The bond between buddies mattered enormously. Frontline soldiers in Korea often formed intense pair relationships, and one army psychiatrist believed that the loss of a buddy could shatter a man's sense of invulnerability with particular force. He suggested that when a soldier's closest companion was killed, wounded, or removed, the thought, "you're next," could arrive with destabilizing power. He also noted that intensive artillery and mortar shelling appeared to be an important factor in psychiatric breakdown. Imagine the experience. You have spent weeks beside the same man, sharing food, cigarettes, complaints, jokes, silences, perhaps even the kind of honesty you would never show in daylight at home. Then one shell lands, one patrol goes wrong, one stretcher moves away from you, and suddenly the person who made survival feel mutual is gone. What remains is not merely grief, it is exposure. This is where the mind begins to search for escape long before alcohol or heroin enters the frame. Escape can take many forms. Some men become reckless, some go quiet, some cling rigidly to routine. Some begin fantasizing about rotation home with an intensity that makes every remaining day feel more dangerous. Army psychiatrists noted that as soldiers neared rotation out of combat, anxiety often increased rather than eased, because the prospect of going home made the risk of dying just before departure seem suddenly unbearable. Stories circulated about men killed on the day they were supposed to rotate, and even if exaggerated, those stories shaped emotion. Relief was coming. That made danger harder to tolerate, not easier. A man does not need to be diagnosed with anything for this to affect him. He only needs to be tired enough, frightened enough, and alone enough inside his own head. The Korean War created those conditions repeatedly. It moved from early chaos to sudden advances, then to reversals after Chinese intervention, then into a long period of static positions and attritional fighting. Army psychiatric histories noticed that casualty patterns changed with these phases. Psychiatric casualties declined during periods of optimism and greater tactical security, then became a renewed concern when conditions worsened. This tells us something simple and important. The soldier's mind responded not only to bullets, but to the meaning of the situation. Hope changed symptoms. Confusion changed symptoms. The belief that the war might soon end changed symptoms. So did the realization that it would not. I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been so tired that you stopped wanting solutions and only wanted silence? Not sleep exactly. Not advice. Just a temporary end to the pressure of having to keep responding. Most of us have felt a mild version of that in ordinary life. Now magnify it by weeks of combat, by cold ground, by the sudden death of men you knew, by the possibility that tomorrow will demand again what today already took from you. That is the mental state in which relief becomes dangerously persuasive. The soldier is not necessarily seeking pleasure. He may be seeking subtraction, less fear, less memory, less alertness, less of himself for a few hours. Alcohol entered that need openly. The Army's own medical account described one form of temporary addiction as a neurotic flight reaction to overseas separation, work frustration, guilt, and other sources of tension. It also stated that the stresses and strains of combat and overseas existence made alcohol problems more prevalent because drinking provided temporary relief from underlying psychological and social difficulties. That observation is central. It gives us a bridge between combat, shock and substance use without forcing a simplistic claim that battle automatically caused addiction. The Army saw that men under pressure sometimes drank in, an effort to get away from what pressure was doing to them, and alcohol could do more than numb. In vulnerable combat veterans, Army physicians observed that drinking sometimes triggered dramatic reliving of battle episodes, resembling the emotional release produced in therapeutic settings by intravenous barbiturates. Some men became frightened. Others turned hostile towards civilians they misperceived as enemy soldiers or guerrillas. One young combat officer on convalescent leave in Japan, after drinking with Japanese civilians on a train, developed paranoid fears that he was being poisoned by communists, fled to a hotel, and then fired his weapon, killing one civilian and wounding others. By the next day, he'd returned to normal awareness and remembered the night as a haze. This is an extreme case, but it reveals how close some wartime memories sat to the surface and how alcohol could weaken the barriers keeping them contained. Heroin entered the picture differently, but it appealed to the same exhausted territory of the mind. The Army's Korean War account did not describe most frontline soldiers as narcotic users. In fact, it found relatively few cases among combat troops, with more concerns centred in Japan and rear Korea. Yet the context matters. A man whose nerves had been battered by shelling, loss, and months of tension might later find himself in Busan, Yokohama, or Kobe, where drugs were available and where others were ready to explain what they did. The heroin itself did not emerge from combat shock, but combat shock could make the promise of chemical quiet more tempting. That is a careful distinction, and an important one. Military psychiatrists also observed that not every psychiatric problem came from the battlefield alone. Some arose from unit conditions, weak or harmful leadership, isolation, and the soldier's feeling that he did not matter. One psychiatrist described a rifle company in which several men developed psychiatric complaints amid fear and resentment toward a commander who had broken down during battle and then been returned to lead them. The psychiatrist argued that to understand the patient, one had to understand what was happening back in the company, not merely search inside the individual for personal defect. This way of thinking is important because addiction, too, rarely belongs only to the private soul. It grows in systems. It grows where men feel trapped, unseen, or unsupported. That insight lets us see Korean War substance used more clearly. The soldier looking for escape may not have been running only from artillery. He may have been running from a unit culture that punished vulnerability, from guilt over surviving when a friend did not, from a commander he no longer trusted, from the humiliation of feeling afraid after everyone around him pretended not to be. When the Army medical history spoke of alcohol as relief from psychological and social difficulties, it was acknowledging that tension had many sources. Battle was the most obvious. It was not the only one. This is also why simple moral judgment fails us. The man who drinks too much after combat may still be brave. The man who seeks heroin in a rear city may still have performed well under fire. The man who breaks down in a clearing station may have held himself together longer than anyone had a right to expect. Korean War psychiatrists understood this better than many civilians did. They did not treat combat exhaustion as a confession of cowardice. They treated it as a predictable casualty of modern battle, as real in its way as a wound. One official history stated bluntly that psychiatric casualties should be expected with the same certainty as battle wounds. That sentence deserves to remain with us. It tells us that the army had learned, painfully, that the mind could be injured by war even when the body remained intact. Yet if the mind could be injured, the war still lacked a fully developed language for what happened after the immediate crisis passed. The system was better at salvage than at long-term understanding. It could identify men who were no longer functioning. It could rest them, sedate them, encourage them, and often send them back. It could recognise that alcohol misuse expressed deeper tension. It could see that some narcotic offenders were vulnerable men pulled into group habits in areas where drugs were available. But connecting all of these elements into a broader theory of chronic wartime distress was still beyond the institutional habits of the time. The formal vocabulary of PTSD would come much later. During Korea, many men were restored to duty, disciplined, evacuated, or quietly left to manage themselves. I think this is one of the saddest features of the story. Not because military doctors were indifferent. Many were observant, practical, and trying to do real good with limited resources. But because the war demanded immediate answers from a system facing long-term injuries. A soldier's shaking hands needed to stop now. His breathing needed to steady now. His unit needed him now. Whether he would drink too heavily on leave 3 months later, whether he would find heroin in a port city because his mind had never really found rest, whether he would come home changed in ways his family could not understand, those questions sat beyond the short horizon of the battlefield clinic. The addiction problem would expose that limitation with painful clarity. It would show that men can be returned to duty before they have truly returned to themselves. That difference is where much of the next part of the history begins. Once a narcotics problem had taken root among American troops in the Far East, stopping it proved far more difficult than simply telling men not to use drugs. That sounds obvious when stated plainly, but it was not always treated as obvious at the time. The army was fighting a brutal war in Korea. It was moving men, food, fuel, ammunition, replacements, medical supplies, and prisoners across a theatre stretched between the peninsula and Japan. Commanders were consumed by the demands of battle and logistics. Against that scale of emergency, narcotic addiction could appear small, limited, almost peripheral. Colonel Albert J. Glass, who served as psychiatric consultant to the Far East Command, later wrote that alcohol and narcotic offenders were a relatively minor problem in the overall campaign, but a constant and ominous concern in Japan and Rear Korea. That phrase captures the dilemma exactly. The issue was serious enough to disturb commanders, yet not so large that the entire system reorganised itself around solving it, and problems that are seen as dangerous but not central often become the hardest to address effectively. At first glance, the army seemed to have a straightforward mission: find the users, identify the suppliers, remove both from the units, make the consequences clear. The difficulty was that very little about narcotic use in the theatre presented itself straightforwardly. Even the scale of the problem was hard to judge. Officers in certain units near Yokohama, Kobe and Busan sometimes claimed that half their men, or more, were using narcotics. Glass believed such estimates were exaggerated because apprehension figures did not confirm numbers that high. Yet the fact that commanders were making such claims tells us something about the atmosphere. They felt surrounded by a problem they could sense but not measure. Men were suspected. Rumours spread. Possession was difficult to prove. Visible signs were inconsistent. Once that kind of uncertainty enters a unit, discipline suffers in two directions at once. Some guilty men escape detection, while some innocent men live under suspicion. The army tried education first because institutions often begin with the belief that information will prevent behaviour. Chaplains and medical officers gave lectures warning troops about the physical, mental and moral damage caused by narcotics. On paper, this looks sensible. A young soldier hears what heroin can do, understands the danger, and chooses not to use it. The difficulty was that men who were already lonely, already exhausted, already influenced by peers, or already convinced they would only try it once did not always respond to a lecture delivered in official language. Glass later concluded that such lectures had shown little value, comparing them to similarly ineffective educational efforts aimed at preventing venereal disease. The problem was not that the information was false. The problem was that information alone could not compete with immediate access, group pressure, emotional need, and the persuasive power of someone saying, in a barracks or a back room, that the danger had been exaggerated. So the army turned to investigation. Undercover agents from the Criminal Investigation Division were placed into suspected units. In theory, they would observe, gain trust, identify drug networks, and produce the evidence needed for punishment. In practice, Glass wrote that these agents were often quickly recognised and achieved little success. That detail says a great deal about unit culture. Soldiers lived closely together. They noticed unfamiliar faces, unfamiliar habits, unfamiliar ways of asking questions. A stranger inserted into a barracks was not always difficult to spot, and once men suspected an infiltrator, they could shut down, move transactions elsewhere, or simply wait. The army was dealing with small, informal networks inside communities where face-to-face recognition mattered. That made conventional undercover work much less effective than administrators might have hoped. Unannounced searches and physical inspections produced little more. Commanders could order shakedowns of quarters, inspect lockers, examine personal effects, and look for syringes or drugs. They could also send suspected men for medical evaluation. But narcotic use was often concealed with care. Glass noted that needle scars had to be sought not only on the forearms, but also on the feet, legs, buttocks and abdomen. The body itself became a hiding place. Even then, marks could be dismissed or explained away. Some users did not show the dramatic weight loss or physical deterioration that officers expected when they pictured an addict. Others were young, intermittent users whose appearance gave little away. In a military setting where proof mattered, suspicion was not enough. A commander might feel certain that a soldier was using heroin and still lack the evidence required to act decisively. Withdrawal symptoms, which might have helped confirm dependence, were also less useful than many expected. Glass reported that well-known withdrawal signs were seldom obvious, even when known users were confined in locked psychiatric wards. In one case, drugs had apparently been smuggled into a hospital, which offered one explanation. But he believed a more likely reason was that many of the young soldiers involved were using smaller amounts, were in earlier stages of addiction, or were indulging only periodically at parties or on weekends. That made diagnosis harder. If a soldier denied using narcotics, showed no major withdrawal, displayed only ambiguous physical signs, and had no drugs on his person, the army had limited options. The institution was confronting a behaviour that could already be harmful and contagious within a unit, while still remaining medically and legally difficult to pin down. The army's difficulties were not only medical, they were social. Glass described units in areas of high drug availability, where narcotic use became accepted in a matter-of-fact way, much as alcoholism could be condoned. That sentence may be one of the most revealing in the entire official account. It tells us that once drug use settled into a group, it could begin to lose its shock value. Men who might have recoiled from heroin in isolation could become accustomed to its presence if others around them treated it as routine. Vulnerable newcomers were initiated by user members of the unit. Groups of addicts formed, exchanged methods for avoiding work and detection, and used sick call as an easy route away from duty. Theft of supplies gave them extra money. What began as individual indulgence could turn into a small internal culture with its own habits, evasions, and mutual protection. That internal culture placed non-users in a difficult position. Glass wrote that men who did not use narcotics, including some senior non-commissioned officers, either feared reporting members of strong drug groups or decided the problem belonged to the police rather than to them. He also noted the broader military dislike of telling tales on fellow soldiers. That phrase sounds almost childish, but in close-knit units it carried real force. Soldiers depended on one another for safety, reputation, and daily survival. Informing on another man could feel like betrayal, even when the conduct threatened the unit as a whole. If rumours circulated that informers might suffer violence or poisoning, whether true or exaggerated, that silence would become even harder to break. Glass mentioned rare deaths by violence or poison that were rumoured to involve users who had threatened to cooperate with authorities. He did not present those stories as firmly established, but he believed they likely discouraged potential informers. Whether the rumours were fully accurate mattered less than the effect they had on behaviour. The command structure itself was not always aligned on what should happen once a narcotic user was identified. Glass stated that because the overall incidence of addiction in the Far East was not judged large enough to qualify as a major crisis, there was no uniform legal or administrative procedure for disposing of addicts. Local commanders handled cases differently. That lack of consistency became especially troubling in Busan during the first year of the war. Known and confessed addicts there could not simply be given undesirable discharges under the applicable regulation, because higher authorities feared that even a punitive discharge might be seen as a reward. In their view, a man might deliberately use drugs if doing so got him shipped home. Another concern was that addicts should not be returned to the United States and inflicted on the civilian population. The language is harsh, but it shows how administrators were thinking. They saw the addict at once as a disciplinary problem, a manpower problem, and a social problem that no one wanted to own. The practical result was damaging. In Busan, disposition of narcotic users often required a general court-martial conviction, which in turn required proof of possession or drug paraphernalia. But evidence was difficult to obtain. Glass wrote that some cases required months of surveillance or detective work. During that time, no narcotic users could remain inside their units and continue spreading the habit or engaging in related misconduct, including theft of supplies. This is one of the clearest explanations for why the army struggled. It had men whom commanders and doctors believed were dangerous influences, but it had built a procedural path that made removal slow unless prosecutors could establish a level of proof that clandestine drug users were careful to avoid. The system had decided that sending users home was risky, but keeping them in place proved risky as well. Japan handled cases somewhat differently. Glass wrote that disposition under the discharge regulation was generally permitted there. Yet even in Japan, medical or psychiatric recommendations were not always followed when a soldier firmly denied using drugs and when neither prominent needle scars nor withdrawal symptoms were present. Again, the army found itself trapped between certainty and proof. A doctor might suspect addiction. A commander might suspect it too. But if the soldier denied everything and the evidence remained circumstantial, removal could stall. The institution did not possess a quick, reliable method for separating the casual user, the early addict, the chronic addict, and the falsely suspected man. That uncertainty weakened action at the very moment when rapid action would have mattered most. Combat units faced a somewhat different problem. Glass reported relatively few narcotic cases among frontline divisions, citing 12 in the 25th Infantry Division over 1 year and 2 in the 3rd Infantry Division during an 8-month period. These cases largely involved chronic addicts whose only source of drugs was stolen medical supplies or bribed medical personnel. That detail is sobering for a different reason. Even where street access was limited, addiction could reach into the military's own medical system. Morphine and other controlled substances had legitimate wartime uses. They were needed for pain relief, surgery, and emergency treatment. But any supply system containing valuable drugs becomes vulnerable to diversion when a desperate user is nearby and safeguards are imperfect. The army could more easily remove these chronic offenders through courts-martial or administrative discharge, yet their existence showed that frontline separation from urban drug markets did not make the problem disappear entirely. There was also a larger difficulty beyond the army's gates. Glass argued that any serious plan had to control the narcotic traffic itself, but he doubted that this could be achieved fully in Japan and Korea, where civilian populations were not under direct military control. He further cited a Cold War interpretation from narcotics officials Harry Anslinger and William Tompkins, who claimed that heroin trafficking from communist China through North Korea, Hong Kong, Japan, and South Korea formed part of an organised political effort to weaken United Nations troops and finance communist activity. That claim was presented seriously in the 1954 Army medical discussion, and it clearly shaped how some American officials interpreted the problem. At the same time, it belongs to a highly charged Cold War environment and should be understood as part of the period's official analysis rather than treated as the only possible explanation for the trade. What matters for the Army's practical struggle is simpler and more certain. Narcotics were available through civilian networks beyond immediate military command, and commanders could not shut those networks down simply by issuing orders to soldiers. The profits were too tempting, the demand too steady, and the military's jurisdiction too limited. Even if an army unit disciplined every soldier caught using heroin, that did not close a nightclub, empty a shopkeeper's hidden stock, or eliminate a dealer waiting outside a rest area. The next transport would bring new customers. The next payday would bring new money. The next frightened or lonely soldier would face the same choice. Addiction inside the ranks was not only a matter of internal discipline, because the supply was not internal. It crossed the boundary between military and civilian worlds over and over again. That meant prevention required cooperation, intelligence, enforcement, and a level of sustained attention that a wartime theatre under pressure did not always manage to provide. Glass believed the army had made a mistake when officers and men regarded narcotics as a relatively minor matter, affecting only a handful of morally defective individuals. In his retrospective view, That attitude encouraged casual handling. He argued that narcotic drugs should instead be seen as an enemy weapon, a threat to tactical effectiveness and security, and he believed that soldiers, possessors, and peddlers should face prompt and stern measures. Whether one accepts all of his Cold War framing or not, his institutional point is plain. If commanders treated drug use as someone else's problem, it spread. If they treated it as a leadership issue tied to unit health and readiness, they had a better chance of containing it. He placed special responsibility on non-commissioned officers. In his judgment, NCOs were the people most likely to know which men were using narcotics, and most able to disrupt the small groups that recruited newcomers. He compared this responsibility to the Army's handling of frostbite. When officers and NCOs were held accountable for frostbite rates under their command, the incidents dropped sharply. Glass suggested that drug addiction should be approached with similar seriousness. Unit leaders in areas where narcotics were readily available, he argued, should be judged partly by how effectively they prevented and eradicated drug use. The proven addict should be removed quickly. Suspected users with meaningful medical evidence against them should not remain in the ranks indefinitely, simply because legal proof of possession was elusive. These were recommendations made in hindsight, and they reveal how dissatisfied he was with the more fragmented responses used during the war itself. This is the point where the story becomes less about the individual addict and more about the limitations of institutions under stress. The Army struggled because the problem had too many dimensions at once. It was a medical problem, but early users did not always show unmistakable symptoms. It was a disciplinary problem, but prosecutors often lacked evidence. It was a leadership problem, but some leaders underestimated it or preferred to hand it off to police. It was a group problem because users protected one another and influenced newcomers. It was an intelligence problem because traffickers operated outside military control. It was a morale problem because endless lectures could not easily compete with the desire for immediate relief. It was even a policy problem because sending addicts home seemed dangerous while keeping them in place could make the situation worse. No single department of the Army owned all of those problems at once, and so the response remained uneven. There is something very modern in that failure, even though the setting belongs to the early 1950s. Institutions often struggle, most with problems that do not fit neatly into one box. A wound goes to the surgeon, a theft goes to military police, a deserter goes to command authority. But addiction crosses everything. It affects health, law, morale, manpower, and group trust. It hides inside ordinary behaviour until it does not. It invites harsh punishment and genuine sympathy at the same time. It raises the question of whether the user is a criminal, a patient, a security risk, or all three. In Korea, the Army did not yet have a fully coherent answer, and that uncertainty gave the problem room to spread in the places where it had already gained a foothold. Perhaps the most painful part of the official account is the sentence saying that known narcotic addicts were sometimes allowed to continue spreading the habit because the mechanisms for removing them were too slow or too restricted. That does not mean commanders wanted addiction to spread. It means they were caught inside rules, assumptions, and fears that made decisive action harder than hindsight suggests it should have been. They feared rewarding drug users with discharge. They feared sending addicts back into civilian America. They wanted evidence strong enough to survive legal scrutiny. All of those concerns had logic behind them, yet together they created delay, and delay favoured the user groups already operating within units. A man considering heroin for the first time did not need the Army to approve. He only needed the Army to fail to interrupt the group beside him. By the later stages of the Korean War, the addiction problem had revealed a hard truth. Preventing drug use was far easier than trying to uproot it after networks had formed. Once men knew the suppliers, once users inside the barracks began initiating newcomers, once informers feared retaliation or shame, once commanders struggled to discharge offenders and investigators struggled to prove possession, the habit had acquired a kind of defensive structure. It was no longer just a secret indulgence. It had become a small underground system operating inside a much larger military system, using the larger system's blind spots against it, and that helps explain why the Korean War matters in the longer history of military addiction. The army was not ignorant. It saw the signs. It wrote about them. It experimented with inspections, lectures, undercover agents, medical examinations, courts-martial and administrative discharge. But it never found a simple way to respond because addiction itself was not simple. It could be hidden by a clever user, spread by a trusted comrade, denied by a soldier who showed few physical signs, sustained by a civilian market beyond command reach, and mishandled by a bureaucracy unsure whether removal or retention was the lesser danger. By the time the army recognised how much all of that mattered, it had already learned the hardest lesson of this story. A narcotics problem does not have to be universal to become corrosive. It only has to take root in the right places, among the right vulnerabilities, and remain there long enough for men who arrived untouched to begin leaving changed. What those officers and doctors were beginning to confront was larger than narcotics alone. The Korean War exposed something the military had already encountered in earlier conflicts, but had not fully settled in its own mind. A soldier can be brave, disciplined, and useful to his unit while also being deeply vulnerable to fear, loneliness, exhaustion, and chemical dependence. None of those things cancel the others out. They coexist. That was one of the hard lessons of Korea. The men who became alcohol offenders or narcotic users were not all the same kind of men. Some entered the service already carrying habits they had hidden during induction. Some were young and impulsive, drawn into small user groups because the drugs were available and because they wanted to belong. Some were worn down by overseas life, poor morale, isolation, or guilt. Some had endured combat and later sought a way to quiet what combat had left behind. The official army account resisted the idea that addiction could be explained by one single cause, and that matters because the war itself refused simple explanations. It revealed first that suffering does not always appear where outsiders expect to find it. A man under fire may appear steady because the demands of the moment force him into action. The same man, weeks later, in a rear area, may unravel in quieter ways. He may drink too much, begin spending time with men who are already using drugs, or seek out the kind of numbness he never would have considered back home. The Army's own medical history noted that combat units were less involved in narcotic offences unless they remained in rear areas for long periods, while the greatest concern appeared in Japan and rear Korea. That pattern tells us something important. Pain does not always express itself at the point of impact. Sometimes it waits until the pressure loosens slightly. Sometimes it emerges in the hotel room, the bar, the port city, the barracks after lights out, when the body is safe enough to feel what it has been suppressing. The Korean War also revealed how much environment shapes dependence. Addiction is often discussed as though it belongs entirely inside the individual, as though the decisive factor is personal weakness or private desire. The army doctors who studied narcotic offenders in the Far East Command saw something more complicated. They wrote that whether vulnerable men became users depended heavily on drug availability, chance assignment, and association with groups that tolerated or encouraged opiate use. Men with similar personality problems did not necessarily become narcotic addicts when they were stationed in combat zones or other areas where opiates were unavailable and where the group did not accept their use. That is an extraordinary observation because it places dependence inside a social setting, rather than treating it as a fixed trait. The same man, under different circumstances, might behave differently. The availability of drugs did not create every addict, but without access, without a group, without the opportunity, many paths into addiction were never opened. This was true of alcohol as well. Cheap liquor, command tolerance, peer expectations, and the accepted custom of drinking to mark relief or camaraderie all made alcohol easier to use as a response to stress. Glass described alcohol misuse not merely as misconduct but as a response to psychological and social tension, including overseas separation, frustration, and guilt. That wording did not excuse the resulting harm, but it recognised that a bottle could become more than recreation in the hands of a man who had few other ways to regulate what he was feeling. The war showed that dependence does not always begin in pleasure. Sometimes it begins in self-treatment. A man drinks because sleep will not come. He drinks because the letter from home said too little. He drinks because the silence after a mission is worse than the noise during it. He drinks because the others are drinking, and he does not want to be the only one who sits with his thoughts sober. There is a tendency, especially when discussing military history, to divide soldiers into those who endured and those who failed. Korea makes that division difficult to defend. Army psychiatrists repeatedly describe psychiatric casualties as an expected part of war, not as rare defects in weak men. They argued that combat psychiatry had to be planned from the beginning of operations, rather than improvised after the damage was already obvious. In the early weeks of the Korean War, psychiatric resources were thin, the tactical situation was chaotic, and immediate priorities centred on first aid, evacuation and surgery. By the time the Busan perimeter stabilised, the army began assigning division psychiatrists and developing more structured care. But the first phase of the war had already shown the danger of beginning a major campaign without adequate psychiatric preparation. That lesson matters for the addiction story because the mind looking for escape is not a separate subject from the mind collapsing under strain. They belong on the same map. One soldier develops a visible combat exhaustion reaction and is pulled from the line. Another remains outwardly functional, then later starts using alcohol or narcotics in a rear area. Another shows neither and simply carries the burden in silence. Institutions tend to respond most readily to what interrupts duty in an obvious way. The man who cannot hold his position attracts attention. The man who performs adequately and then falls apart in private may not. Korea revealed how many forms suffering can take, and how unevenly systems recognise them. The war also forced military doctors to confront the difference between making a man operational again and understanding what he had endured. The psychiatric service in Korea became highly practical. Its goal, often, was to treat men close to the front, restore confidence, and return them to useful duty whenever possible. This was based on lessons learned in World War II, and it often worked in the short term. Many psychiatric casualties did return to duty after brief treatment, yet even the Army's own historians admitted that long-term follow-up was limited or absent in several areas. They could record that a man resumed his place in the organisation. They could not always say what happened inside him afterward. They could not always know whether he later developed a drinking pattern, sought narcotics, or came home with wounds that did not surface until the war was years behind him. There is no need to force a direct connection where the records do not give us one. Not every man treated for combat exhaustion became addicted. Not every soldier who used narcotics had recently broken down under fire. But the Korean War makes it impossible to pretend that mental strain and substance use belong to completely unrelated worlds. The same theatre that recorded the value of early psychiatric support also recorded that alcohol relieved inattention, that narcotic use spread among vulnerable men in permissive settings, and that commanders struggled to manage both. Put together, those observations form a larger picture. Soldiers were not machines that could be wound up, deployed, rotated, and returned unchanged. Their bodies and minds reacted to what was asked of them. Some reactions were visible, others were hidden. Dependence belonged to that hidden category, often enough that it deserves a central place in the story. The rotation system introduced during the Korean War sharpened this lesson in another way. On one hand, rotation became one of the great preventive measures against total psychological exhaustion. By allowing individual relief from combat independent of the uncertain pace of armistice talks, it reduced the sense that a soldier might be trapped indefinitely. The Army's psychiatric account regarded rotation as a major advance in preventive psychiatry. At the same time, doctors saw that the approach produced its own emotional problems. As a soldier neared his departure date, his anxiety could increase sharply. Group identification weakened as he began thinking more about survival and homecoming than the shared mission. Some short-timers found battle fear harder to bear precisely because they were so close to leaving. The Korean War showed that even reforms designed to protect mental health could create fresh forms of strain. There was no perfect system. There were only better and worse ways of managing human limits. That matters because dependence often grows in the gaps between systems. A rotation policy may reduce one kind of distress while intensifying another. A leave program may restore morale for many men while exposing some to vice markets that exploit their exhaustion. A disciplinary system may deter obvious misconduct while making treatment more difficult if addicts fear punishment more than they trust help. A command may insist that a drug user is a threat to unit effectiveness and still fail to remove him quickly because proof is difficult to gather. Korea revealed again and again that the soldiers' suffering was being managed inside institutions built first for victory and only secondarily for emotional survival. That was not an insult to the army. It was the nature of wartime bureaucracy. But it explains why addiction could persist in the spaces between policy, medicine, and command. The way army physicians classified addicts also tells us a great deal about the period. In one psychiatric account, narcotic and alcohol addicts were grouped under pathological personalities and treated primarily through administrative or disciplinary measures rather than medical evacuation. That terminology belongs to its time, and it reflects a mindset very different from modern approaches to addiction. Yet even within that older framework, doctors recognised that these men appeared mostly in rear areas, that environment played a major role, and that there were administrative limitations in handling them consistently. The Korean War sat at a turning point. Addiction was still frequently interpreted through moral weakness and character defects, but the evidence gathered in the theatre kept pointing toward broader forces: stress, availability, group influence, and policy failure. The medical language had not fully changed. The facts were already pushing against it. That tension between older judgment and newer understanding may be the most important thing the war reveals about dependence. On one side stood the soldier as offender, someone who endangered discipline, spread bad habits, stole supplies, and weakened the unit. That picture was not invented. Some users did exactly those things, and commanders had legitimate reasons to worry. On the other side stood the soldier as sufferer, someone responding badly to loneliness, trauma, fear, or a drug market that found him at his most vulnerable. That picture was also real. The Korean War did not resolve the contradiction. It exposed it. Addiction could damage the military while also revealing the damage war had done to the addict. The institution wanted a clean answer. The reality was not clean. When Glass argued that narcotics should be treated as a tactical and security concern rather than dismissed as a private vice, he was speaking from the point of view of a wartime command structure. He believed users, peddlers, and possessors required stern action, and he was frustrated by attitudes that minimized the problem. But beneath his argument lay a broader recognition. Addiction affected more than the individual. It touched readiness, trust, morale, unit cohesion, and the ability of commanders to rely on the men under them. A soldier hiding a narcotic habit was not only risking himself, he was participating in a pattern that could alter the culture of a whole barracks or support unit. The Korean War showed that dependence, once embedded in military life, became a collective issue even when it began as a private act. At the same time, the war showed the danger of thinking that punishment alone can solve dependence. The army did punish. It investigated. It removed some offenders through courts-martial and undesirable discharge. Yet Glass's own account makes clear that suppression efforts were inconsistent and often frustrated by concealment, limited evidence, and civilian supply networks beyond military control. Lectures had little effect. Undercover efforts were easily detected. Physical inspections rarely produced decisive results. The most powerful preventive factor he identified was not fear of punishment alone, but whether the soldier found himself in an environment where drugs were available and tolerated. That is a more subtle and more enduring lesson. Dependence thrives when opportunity, Distress and social permission align. Break one of those links, and the risk falls. Leave all three intact, and stern speeches do very little. If we step back from the military paperwork and look at the human beings inside it, the lesson becomes even more direct. Soldiers in Korea were often very young. They faced adult fears before they had lived much adult life. They moved through foreign cities built around temporary exchange. They served in a war that fluctuated between movement and stalemate, hope and reversal, intense combat and waiting. Some had close friends killed beside them. Some worked in rear roles and still felt guilt, resentment, or isolation. Some were nearing rotation and became more anxious as home came within reach. Some entered the war with habits already formed. Some left it with habits that had begun only months earlier. The official records cannot restore every face to us, but they do enough to prevent easy judgment. There is something especially haunting about the way dependence appears in this history as both symptom and temptation. It was a symptom of strain in the sense that men often use substances to relieve inner pressure. It was a temptation because relief did not arrive neutrally. It arrived through a world of suppliers, profiteers, permissive peers, and cities reshaped by military demand. The soldier did not merely decide in a vacuum. He made decisions inside a system of invitations. That is not the same as saying he had no agency. It means agency was exercised under pressure, and history becomes more truthful when it admits pressure exists. The Korean War also reminds us that suffering can be both ordinary and invisible. Most soldiers did not become addicts. Most did not collapse psychiatrically. Most performed their duty and moved through the war without leaving behind records that describe their inner lives. But that does not mean they were untouched. Official military histories are often forced to count the countable. Arrests, admissions, cases, discharges, percentages. Human experience is less obedient. There were men who drank more than before but never entered a report. Men who tried narcotics once and never again. Men who wanted to but did not. Men who carried their loneliness into marriage, work, and fatherhood without ever calling it by a medical name. The addiction cases we can see in the archive matter, partly because they reveal the edge of a much wider burden the archive measures poorly. By the end of the war, the army had learned practical lessons about psychiatric planning, the value of field treatment, the benefits and complications of rotation, and the need to take narcotics seriously in overseas theatres where civilian access was difficult to control. It had also learned, even if not always in language we would use now, that the emotional life of soldiers could not be treated as an afterthought. Gluss wrote that future combat operations should include psychiatric programs from the outset, rather than repeating a wait-and-see approach that allowed predictable casualties to accumulate before systems caught up. The addiction history belongs beside that warning. It showed that waiting carries a cost, waiting to provide mental support, waiting to address drug availability, waiting to remove entrenched offenders from vulnerable units, waiting to recognise that a man's deterioration might be more than misconduct. And perhaps that is where this story leaves us, not with a single conclusion, but with a clearer understanding of what war asks of people. It asks them to endure fear without showing too much of it, to grieve quickly and move again, to adapt to foreign places, to separate from home, to trust strangers with their lives, and to accept that the future may shorten without warning. Some people carry that burden without obvious collapse. Some cannot. Some reach for chemical relief and discover too late that relief has a price. The Korean War revealed that dependence was not merely a private failing tucked away in the corners of military life. It was one of the ways strain became visible. It exposed the soldier's need for rest, belonging, treatment, and protection from environments that profited from weakness. It forced commanders and doctors to notice that a man can be endangered not only by enemy fire, but also by the desperate wish to feel nothing for a few hours,